Okay, greetings, colleagues, joining us from across the region. Good afternoon and good evening from wherever you join us today. I see that we have a few participants already online, so perhaps we'll make a start. Sorry, colleagues, here. Can you also hear Rebecca? How about now? So, how about now, colleagues? Is it good? Any echo? No echo. Okay. Anyway, colleague, I think it's past time, so perhaps make us greetings, everyone. Thank you so much for time this afternoon. I'm very excited because of the Pacific for an assessment. We do have an excellent 9 speakers who are here as some discussions, social assessment. But before
Ivan, you're breaking up.
can you hear me now?
We can hear you, but what's happening is you're breaking up, so we can hear half of what you're saying.
Okay, I think you're making at least, so might be. Just give us a sec. Apologies for just IT. So please give us 5. You. Okay, colleagues, we're back. Do we sound better now? Hope there's no breakage. Okay, okay, perfect. Anyway, colleagues, you're not here to listen to me. You're here to listen to our exciting speakers. So I'll make sure I run through this opening formality so we can get to the crux of our discussion today. But before we go any further, colleagues, as is our Pacific way, please join me in welcoming my colleague, Mr. Puta Tofinga, to open our session today with a word of prayer. So, Puta, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ivan, and let's so bow down our head, prayer. We thank you, Lord, for this opportunity to converge in this online platform for webinar. We thank you for our life, the life of the facilitators here, the speakers, and the participants who are joining us from different countries and regions. Lord, what we are going to discuss is all about your creation and your people. And therefore, we ask for your guidance and blessing, please, upon us throughout this webinar session. We pray to you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much, Puta. And colleagues, to officially welcome you all today and maybe set the scene for our discussion, I'm pleased now to invite my colleague, Mr. Vai Nupo Youngblood, who is our Environmental Monitoring and Reporting Advisor here at SPREP, to share some remarks. Vai?
Thank you, Ivan, and Tsalo Falawa, and warm Pacific greetings to everyone joining us for today's webinar. On behalf of SPREP management and staff, it is my pleasure to welcome you all to this special PNEA Talanoa on common challenges in social impact assessment in the Pacific, lessons and best practices. Today's webinar represents a significant step forward for our PNEA community. For too long, environmental impact assessments in our region have focused primarily on biophysical impacts. But as we know, development in the Pacific cannot be separated from our social fabric, our cultural heritage, and our traditional ways of life. Our Pacific communities are unique. We have strong communal land ownership systems and customary governance structures that have guided us for generations, and an intricate relationship between our people and our natural environment. When development projects come to our shores, whether they're infrastructure developments, tourism projects, mining operations, or renewable energy installations, they don't just impact the physical environment, they touch the very heart and essence of who we are as Pacific peoples. They can affect traditional access to resources, disrupt customary practices, alter social dynamics within communities, and sometimes threaten the preservation of cultural knowledge and practices for the future. This is why social impact assessment is not just important, it is essential. Yet we know that many practitioners, project developers, and even government officials struggle with getting it right. Today, we're bringing together experienced voices to share honest insights about the challenges we face, and more importantly, the practical solutions that can help us do it better. We've structured today's session as an interactive Talanoa, true to our Pacific tradition of open and respectful dialogue. We'll hear from our expert speakers, but more importantly, we'll want to hear from you, our regional and national practitioners and participants. Your questions, your experiences, and your challenges. These are what will make today's discussion truly valuable and fruitful. With that, I thank you and welcome you once again to this important Talanoa. Soifua. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vi. I think that's the perfect note on which to start our Talanoa today. But before I introduce our distinguished speakers today, just to note, colleagues, we have two speakers joining us today, and they will be sharing with us two very separate but also very interesting presentations. As you always know, colleagues, this is interactive. So we have the chat function there. Please feel free to drop any comments or any thoughts or questions in the chat while our presenters present on their topics. And after both presentations, as usual, we'll have our Q&A session where we invite you all to sort of share your own experiences and ask any questions to our two lovely speakers. And also just to note, we will be recording today's session, and we'll have that ready for participants who may have missed today's session or who would like to revisit the excellent dialogue that we'll be sharing today. Now, with that being said, colleagues, for our speakers today, we do have two distinguished ladies joining us for the presentation. We were supposed to have three, but unfortunately, one of our colleagues from the World Bank, Ms. Joyce Onguglo, was unable to join the discussion. But joining our discussion today, first we have Ms. Rebecca Roebuck. Now, Rebecca is the Director for Social Impacts. That's Impacts with an X. And she's joining us from Australia. Rebecca brings an extensive hands-on experience in social impact assessment across the Pacific region. She's worked on projects ranging from large infrastructure developments to community-based initiatives, and has seen firsthand challenges and opportunities in implementing effective SIA in the region. So Rebecca will be focusing today on some of the common challenges in SIA practice, sharing insights about mistakes she's observed and practical solutions that can help us avoid these pitfalls. So Rebecca, welcome and thank you for joining us today. Now, our second speaker is Professor Elise Huffer, and I think she's no stranger to many of you who are joining this discussion today. Elise is an adjunct associate professor at the Oceania Center for Arts, Culture, and Pacific Studies at the University of the South Pacific. Professor Huffer is also the Vice Chair for Oceania on the Commission on Environmental, Economic, and Social Policy with IUCN. So Professor Huffer today will be exploring cultural heritage considerations in impact assessment, examining how we can better integrate cultural heritage protection and traditional knowledge systems into our assessment frameworks while respecting Indigenous knowledge and practices. So Bula, Professor Huffer, and welcome, and also thank you so much for joining us today. Now, without much ado, perhaps I'll hand it over to Rebecca to share with us her discussion for today. The floor is yours, Rebecca.
Great, thank you so much, Ivan. Just checking you can hear me okay, and my presentation is showing on the screen as well.
Yes, we can hear and see your presentation very well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ivan, and thank you for the introduction, and really I think fantastic from a social impact advisor perspective to hear about the importance being considered for social impact assessment in the region. I couldn't agree more with those opening remarks in terms of the criticality of social impact assessment in the Pacific. As Ivan mentioned, I'm a social impact advisor. I'm Australian. I'm based in Brisbane, in Australia. I do a lot of my work in the Asia Pacific region and as well as Australia. And I focus mainly on supporting the infrastructure, energy, and development sectors. And I've had the opportunity to work on a number of projects in the Pacific. When Ivan first approached me about speaking about this topic, I was a little bit reluctant in terms of recognising, I guess, my own, position as an international consultant that comes into the Pacific. So I'm really mindful that, I guess, what I'm going to be sharing and my perspectives are from that sort of frame, as while I've had the opportunity to work in a number of Pacific countries, I also lived in the North Pacific during 2019, 2020 in Palau as an Australian volunteer as well. I am still an international consultant, sort of coming into the region. So as Ivan mentioned, we'd love to hear from everyone, I guess, participating on this webinar. So as I go through, I guess what I wanted to share with you, it'd be great to hear where you're from, and if there's any particular learnings or tips that you have as we go along as well. As Ivan mentioned, I'm based in Brisbane, and yeah, so in terms of sort of focus for today, what I thought would be most helpful would really be just to share, I guess, from my own experiences of working in the Pacific region, some of the common mistakes that I've seen happen around social impact work in the Pacific. Either ones that I've made a few myself, so I'm happy to share some of those. But I think you see a lot as well, and I think the more that we can share and learn together about better ways of doing things, the better outcomes that we can actually help get from projects. There's a lot of investment going into the Pacific at the moment. As mentioned, infrastructure projects and renewable energy projects and mining projects, and there's, I guess, an incredible opportunity at the moment to not only make sure that we manage the potential for social harm from a lot of those projects, but actually try and realise as much benefit as we can from them for communities and people as well. So I think we've got a really great opportunity right at this point in time in the Pacific to help contribute to that, particularly in our role where we are involved in environmental or social impact assessment. So what I thought I'd share are just some common mistakes, as I mentioned, that I've seen. I'll go through each of these and I guess how I've seen them play out on particular projects, and give some tips from my perspective about how to either avoid making these same mistakes, or some alternative ways of doing things. I'm very much of the view that social impact assessment is context specific. So what might work in one project might not work in another project. The Pacific is a very diverse region. Different countries, even within countries, there's a lot of diversity as well. So the tips I'll give are very sort of general, sort of high level ones. But yeah, I would encourage you to think about what's most appropriate in your context as well. So similar to the opening remarks, the mistake I see happen quite often is actually underestimating the significance of social impact, as has been mentioned in the opening remarks. And I think there's been some really good efforts around environmental impact assessment, but often social impact assessment has been lacking in Pacific projects. And I feel the thing I think is quite common in the Pacific is you'll often find during project implementation there'll be a combined environment and social safeguards officer role. And I know there's probably some people on the call they're in those positions, and I think they're really difficult positions to do well because, for those officers, they're required to have sort of knowledge across environment and social, and to balance both environmental impact assessment or monitoring and social impact monitoring. So my advice around this space is really to think about whether you have got enough emphasis on the social as well as the environment as part of projects, and put particular effort into monitoring social impact both during sort of construction activities and post implementation as well. As I mentioned, often they're kind of combined and lumped in together in Pacific projects, and I would really encourage you to think about whether you do have enough resources in that space or need any specialist expertise there. My experience has been, particularly where you've got donor-funded projects, there is a lot of willingness there to help support and fund that sort of social impact monitoring, but often it needs to be prompted to identify, look, this actually needs to happen and we need some additional resources to do that. So I would just encourage you to just think about how how you are balancing the environment and social together, and whether you've got enough emphasis on the social as well as environment. Just like you might sort of monitor, say, sediment control for environmental controls on a project, it's also really very critical that you're also monitoring your social impact management and mitigation controls as well. As has been mentioned in the opening remarks as well, one of the real sort of, I think, characterising features of the Pacific is the customary governance and land uses and practices and cultural practices, and it's very, very different in each country. And I have seen mistakes made where social impact assessments have relied on either formal land records or perhaps even satellite imagery. I've seen some initial resettlement proposal work done where someone has looked at a satellite imagery and says, oh, there's just one house here, we don't need to worry about this area, it's, no one else is living there, and failing to really understand that this might be an area where there might be customary land uses happening, there could be a whole range of informal uses happening in that space, such as particularly around sort of coastal areas. There could be land that people use in terms of their family crop planting, so a whole range of different things can happen in land uses. So that's a really, really common mistake area, and I think my advice in this space is to actually make the effort to go and visit site, particularly where you've got projects where there is going to be a change to a particular physical area. So you can actually understand, how a site is being used, and do take the opportunity to try and talk to a range of different local people as well. It might be, for example, that men and women use the space differently, whether it's land or sea, and also two people of different ages. I think young people particularly can sometimes use areas in different ways than older people. I remember I was in a on site actually in a Pacific country, and someone pointed to a little sort of pathway and cleared area, and they said to me, this is the local lovers lane, this is where the teenagers go at night time to get away from older people and perhaps be with their boyfriend or girlfriend. And it's that kind of local knowledge that you wouldn't know unless you were sort of speaking to local people and actually visiting the site. So I think that's really important in the Pacific, and to recognise those informal rights and informal land uses are often the most common form of use, I think, in many land environments. Along those lines too, just talking about sort of customary and sort of local people too. If you're not familiar with the concept of pre-prior informed consent, I'll put a link actually at the end of this session for you. But these are international principles really around engaging meaningfully with Indigenous people before you actually undertake activity. So they have the opportunity to understand what might be involved in a project, and if they're supportive of the project, give their free, prior and informed consent to sort of activities to be happening. And that this is, they certainly have a range of principles as part of this around, how to do that in an appropriate way, but also to understand all those aspects in terms both of rights, but also customary uses, where there might be, for example, some particular significance of areas as well. But I want to touch on a few things too that Elise will speak on, but I don't consider myself a specialist in this area, and I would say if you are working on a project that does have a strong potential for impact on Indigenous peoples or particularly Indigenous rights, do consider getting specialist advice in this area and engaging specialist consultants, because it's an area that you really do want to get right. And certainly there have been projects that have happened where people have lost their, particularly Indigenous people have lost their ability to go and access spaces that they would have accessed before, for example, or they're not able to practice their local cultural activities. Talking about, I guess, cultural appropriateness, again, I think most people in the Pacific will be well aware of this, and I think it's particularly the case where you have international consultants, perhaps like myself, that might come into country and not understand what might be appropriate in terms of how to engage with local people. Some of the things I think are really important in terms of cultural engagement methods is, I think, particularly to try and use opportunities that provide open-ended dialogue opportunities rather than perhaps sort of yes/no type questions to really mitigate positive bias. That there is often a reluctance I found in my work in the Pacific for people to let you know if maybe they weren't happy about something, or if they've got a particularly negative view about something. Often that's not said directly. I would encourage you to think about some of the Pacific methodologies that are around. I really like the Kakala research framework from Tonga. I think that's a really helpful one. I think other things to sort of look out for in this aspect too is I've seen consultations happen where you don't really acknowledge local power dynamics, and that could be about gender or could just be about local status or culture. I was involved in some community consultation sessions a couple of years ago, actually, and we were doing consultation in a whole heap of different communities throughout a country, like different island communities. And the first session we had, I thought it was going along. It was actually in local language, so I was there and I couldn't actually understand what was speaking. I was just sort of observing how people were talking, and then someone was interpreting for me. But the discussion was dominated by this one person, and every time someone spoke, this person would then speak afterwards. And it was explained to me afterwards that the person that was speaking was the town officer. So basically someone would say something and the town officer would give a formal position back, and it might not agree with what that person said. So it was a good, I guess, learning for me in terms of understanding that, when you have people in consultation situations, for example, they might be, have more status from a cultural perspective, or perhaps they're in a formal role like a town officer, just to actually be aware that those can play out in terms of what people will say or what sort of views are given weight in consultation. Some of the processes I've used to try and mitigate that kind of aspect, so you hear from a broad range of people equally where possible, is sometimes it can be appropriate to separate out men and women, for example, to have separate consultations. It might be, for example, that you talk to young people separately as well. So there's lots of different sort of ways you can do this, but I think this is a really common mistake area in the Pacific, where I've seen international consultants especially come in and have a meeting and think everything went really well, and everyone nodded their head and said this is a really great project, but actually they weren't actually picking up on some of the subtleties where there might be, maybe there were some different views that people just weren't expressing. So I think that's something really to be mindful of. I've just made a note on the slide too about being trauma informed as well. I think some of the projects that we do work on in the Pacific, I'm thinking about some examples where I've been involved in work post disasters. People might be experiencing trauma, and people might cry in a meeting. They might be really upset, and I think, ensuring that you're also consulting in a way that provides support for people, and that might be, for example, being able to link them up to support people afterwards as well. So I think that's a really common area where I think a lot of mistakes happen in social impact assessment work, and this is one where I think being culturally appropriate is really appropriate in terms of methodology, but also for countering for sort of those power dynamics within consultations as well, so that everyone is able to be heard equally. Along that sort of engagement line, I did want to talk about digital risks and opportunities. And the reason I wanted to mention that is I probably myself will find that I will tend to assume that if we're doing a Pacific social impact assessment type of work, that a face-to-face consultation approach is the best way to go, that we'll have to have lots of meetings or workshops with people. But I think that's a mistake too. There is increasing really excellent digital connectivity in many parts of the Pacific now, not everywhere, but certainly we've seen the satellite sort of connections with Starlink. We've seen the cables come into play, and there are increased speeds for people to be able to access through smartphones and other devices. So I think it's often a mistake for people to assume that you can't use digital engagement methods in the Pacific. I think, things like considering, whether you can use social media or WhatsApp messaging. At the moment, where I'm involved in a project where we're doing some training in Tonga actually right this week, and a part of our sort of feedback for that, we're using an online survey with QR codes, and the early feedback we have with that is that that's working well. People do have devices, they can do that rather than relying on the paper kind of survey techniques. So I would encourage you, don't be afraid of the digital. Try it, see if it works in different environments. On the other side of that, though, is and I was probably just mentioned too, in the concept of particularly the digital can be quite good in terms of providing a level playing field for people. So if you're in a remote area, or perhaps, you're a female business owner, sometimes being online can be quite good because it's, it sort of levels the playing field in some ways where people not necessarily have any stereotypes or biases. They just, see a business like any other business sort of online. It is worth probably noting, though, that there is, with that increased connectivity and use of the online space, there is the potential for social harm, and we're seeing in the Pacific increased frequency around online harm, social risks. I was doing some work recently in the Pacific in a particular country, and I was talking to the local police about gender-based violence, and the local police officer said to me, look, most of the incidents we get now, I think he said like 75, 80% of incidents they have are actually online harassment, rather than sort of in-person gender-based violence type incidents. And you're thinking there about, people that might be harassed online, or maybe, there's sharing of explicit images, all these sorts of things are happening as well. So that was quite eye-opening me to understand that that online space is really, really critical to think about from a social impact assessment. The other thing I think is really key for projects to think about is misinformation that might spread online about a project. So as part of understanding, particularly communication about your project or engagement, is actually making sure that there's accurate information available online about projects as well. So that's what I wanted to say about digital. I think there's some really great opportunities there, but also, it's important not to underestimate the related digital risks as well, from a social impact assessment work, which can be really relevant for projects. If you think about perhaps workers that are coming into a community that might be engaging online with other local community members, it's something to keep in mind, as well as the traditional sort of what you might see in a community sort of physical safety setting. Along those lines, it's probably most relevant for social safeguarding considerations in terms of social impact assessment. But it is a mistake to assume that there are local services and supports available. For example, if, for example, you're expecting for, not every island community in the Pacific will have most will, but not everyone will have a local health clinic. You might have a local police officer perhaps stationed on most islands, but that's not always the case. And the sorts of supports and services you might see in an urban area, such as, access to lawyers or other types of sort of general counselling services, for example, aren't widely available everywhere in the Pacific. And a lot of the requirements that you'll have from donor funded projects, the big multilateral banks, or overseas aid, for example, they'll expect some quite robust grievance procedures for projects, and that there is that support available for community members or staff and workers involved in projects. So I think in relation to that is about actually testing, what services and supports are available in an area for your project. I would encourage you to test things like contact numbers and actually see if they work, including if an incident happened sort of after hours. For example, if there was an incident with a worker and a community member, and it happened at 9 p.m. on a Thursday evening, you know, what supports would be around to actually, you know, support that person at that time of night in that locality. And I think that testing is really important. Often, you know, how people can get hold of people is actually not the formal phone number. It might be through Facebook messaging or other things as well. And actually understanding how that works is I think, really critical. And it might not work, I suppose, is my point. Someone, you know, that critical person that was providing maybe the counselling support, maybe they're off island for 2 months. So that support's not really there. The other thing I wanted to mention, I think this is a really critical area for particularly the social safeguard expectations, which are increasing among the donor funded projects. The thing I would mention here too, things like gender-based violence or other incidents that are culturally sensitive, they might not be reported formally. And in fact, I'll say they're probably likely not to be reported formally. So that means in terms of particularly social safeguard work and in that sort of social impact space, particularly that sort of education and awareness is really key. But I would also encourage project teams, you know, to also recognise that often those incidents won't be reported formally, and just to be on the lookout, I suppose, for you know, people that might be looking uncomfortable. I've been in situations in a meeting where someone has said to me, they pointed a person to me on the project team and said, "Oh, look, that's a bad person," and they won't tell you why that person's a bad person, but you'll just get a sense that maybe something has happened. So I think, you know, that's something just to be mindful of in the Pacific is, you know, the supports and services aren't necessarily always available. You know, test the sort of systems that you have in place, and just be, I guess, mindful for some of those things maybe that aren't reported formally, but that might be something from a project perspective it's worth you sort of being mindful of if you get a sense maybe something might be wrong somewhere as well. And finally, I suppose to finish off with as well, personally, probably a personal thing, but I think in the Pacific too, often I've seen documents that are really overly long and complex. And I'm thinking, you know, some of the donor funded projects, there's a lot of expectations regarding, you know, very robust analysis and management plans and documents, and you can end up with these massive documents that sit on someone's shelf or in someone's drawer and people don't use. So my advice in this space is social impact management particularly should be something that's live during a project, and that if you have a social impact management plan or a social safeguards plan, it should be something that you can pick up and use and actually implement. So my advice here is sometimes it can be helpful to separate up documents. So if you've got, like, for example, a project where you needed to do like a big needs analysis or explain, local context, have that in a separate document. And for your management plan, keep that as short and simple as possible. I would encourage you to think about, using things like infographics rather than lots of long text on plans and documents, and also to think about local language or what the appropriate language is. For some of the projects, I'm thinking actually in the North Pacific, where I've seen a lot of construction workers that are perhaps Bangladeshi or come from the Philippines, or Chinese workers. Having that in the local knowledge, the local language in the North Pacific, isn't necessarily going to be helpful or in English. Actually thinking about the language of the workers or whoever's going to use these documents is really important as well, so that people can actually practically use them. So that's my tip there. It's a mistake I see often, these really long, lengthy plans, and I think it's really difficult for people, consultants like myself, or people working on projects, to get the right balance there, because you do need the robustness and the detail to basically ensure you have done your job well in terms of the robustness of social impact assessment, but you still need something practical at the end that you can use as well. So I think that's something that can be really helpful to think through. So yeah, just to summarise, I guess along with those sort of common mistakes that I've seen or I've been involved in making myself, it's just, I guess, my main tips really for working in the Pacific and social impact is making sure that you do give social impact sufficient separate consideration, particularly alongside environmental considerations. Ensure you have that really good understanding of informal land rights and land uses in your project area. Consider free, prior and informed consent for Indigenous people if it's relevant for your project, and consider whether maybe you need specialist advice in this area. When you are conducting engagement as part of social impact work or social impact assessment, especially, being mindful of those local power and gender dynamics, and use really inclusive and culturally appropriate engagement methods. As I mentioned, don't ignore the digital space. This is, I think, really a growing area for social impact practice in the Pacific at the moment. As I mentioned, that sort of digital harm is an area particularly to watch, I think, in terms of social safeguard issues in projects. Regularly test project support and grievance mechanisms. As I mentioned, those services and supports aren't always available, and that's something I think particularly if you don't have experience in the Pacific, you might not appreciate that and how significant that can be. And as I mentioned, it's probably a bit of a personal thing from my perspective, but where you can, try and keep your social impact documents and your processes simple and practical, so they're actually used and people can make use of them. So I might stop sharing there. Just to mention as well, here are my contact details. If you did want to connect, you're very welcome to connect with me after this as well. And I might hand back to you, Ivan, I think.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. That was an excellent and concise presentation. I love how you put it around, the 7, key challenges that you have sort of seen or experienced. And I think it's a really wonderful way to package those very important points. So thank you very much, Rebecca. And we do have quite a few participants who are also on the chat introducing themselves. People joining us from all across the Pacific, including the North Pacific. So thank you so much for those of you who just joined us as well. I would love to pause here for some questions, Rebecca, but because again, we're limited on time. So perhaps I would invite Professor Elise to share her presentation with us. And then we'll have sort of that Q&A session after both presentations. And with that being said, Professor Elise, I'll hand it over to you now.
Thank you, Ivan, and Bula Binaka, everyone. Let me see if this works. Okay. All right. Okay, I think we're set. Yes, so hello everyone. Ali to Calvin, I recognize one name, and I see there's a good participation from Palau. So Ali to all of you. I started with this kind of a bit slightly cheeky title, Our Cultural Impact Assessments, the Future of Environmental Impact Assessments. And I've done that because in this presentation, as you'll see, there's been a sort of a progression towards considering culture as an essential part of environmental impact assessments. I think Vi, in his introduction, touched on that, the close relationship between nature and culture, environment and culture in the Pacific Islands. But as he also pointed out, currently EIAs tend to be very focused on the biophysical and much less on people and their way of life. So I just wanted to start this presentation, and please excuse me because it's slightly more academic than Rebecca's one, but I wanted to start this presentation with a couple of quotes that one is from the 2050 Strategy for the Blue Pacific and the thematic area 4 on the resources and economic development. And I'm not going to read it out to you, but basically it acknowledges the strategy in our region, acknowledges the importance of bringing together environmental, social, and cultural impact assessments. And cultural impact assessments are not social impact assessments. They are something that stands alone, and we will see what that means. And the strategy also talks about strengthening these mechanisms and reflecting cultural values and traditional knowledge. And the way to do that is when you're talking about impact assessments is clearly through cultural impact assessments. The second quote I wanted to share with you is, and some of you may not be aware of this position within the UN, but there is a UN Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights. That position was established in 2009, so you can see that's fairly recent. But I really like this quote, which is in one of the current UN Special Rapporteur's reports. And all of these are on the UN website. If you go to UN Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights, you will find all of these. There's, I don't know how many reports. There's country reports, there's reports on cultural heritage, what is cultural heritage in terms of cultural rights, et cetera, et cetera. But I think this quote is important, and Rebecca touched on the concept of free, prior, informed consent, which I think most of you would be familiar with, and then the consultation and active participation of persons and communities that are affected directly or indirectly. And without doing this, without addressing living heritage or a cultural significance of natural resources, impact assessments should basically be rejected as insufficient and incomplete. So just as a couple of starting quotes, I think those kind of bring a lot of punch with them. So what I'm going to talk about is, and very quickly, I'm going to go through the global changes which have led to greater emphasis on CIAs, which is why we're here today. I'm going to talk a bit about the ACWECON guidelines, which are really important because it's the only true definition of cultural impact assessments, and should be familiar to everyone working in the environmental sector. And then I'm going to give, some more details of how cultural impact assessments are considered, globally, and then look at some cultural impact assessments in Pacific Island countries, and then look at how we should hopefully move forward. Okay, so without going into huge detail, I just wanted to give some sort of timelines of how we've moved with the 72 conference and declaration, then 87 Our Common World, Brundtland report, and then some big milestones, or like the Indigenous and Tribal People Convention of the International Labor Organization, because that kind of sets out the rights of Indigenous peoples. And a lot of, cultural impact assessments and thinking about culture in the environmental field is very much linked to Indigenous peoples and local communities. So a lot of the, oops, I don't know why this is not, okay. Right, so these are the moves towards considering culture as part of environment. And again, bringing in this dimension, which is very clear and long-standing among Indigenous cultures, right? And which is the case for us in the Pacific. So this acknowledgement in 92 that environment and culture are not separate, but they're interwoven. So then you have, this leads to the Convention on Biological Diversity with the Article 8J, which is really about including and acknowledging and respecting the rights of Indigenous peoples when it comes to environmental sustainability. So the Aqua Econ guidelines, which are really a milestone, but they are voluntary, right? So it's somewhat different from other. I guess when countries commit to conventions, having something that is a commitment versus something that is voluntary does make a difference, right? But these guidelines are here. And especially what's important from our perspective is that they do provide a definition of what is a cultural impact assessment in the context of the convention. Right. So you have all this happening on the environmental side, but at the same time, UNESCO, which is the UN organization on science, culture, and education, is also developing its own conventions, and one that's really important in terms of, well, there's two that are crucial in terms of cultural impact assessments. One is the Convention on World Heritage, which is from 1972. But the other one that's really important is what's commonly known as the Convention on Intangible Cultural Heritage. And that's a convention that dates from 2003. And almost all of our countries in the Pacific are party to both those conventions. And the ICH one is really important because it's really about traditional knowledge and practices, right? So it contains everything in culture that is not tangible, i.e. not a site or something that you can touch, but, well, it's a bit more complicated than that. But anyway, it doesn't, the World Heritage one is really about the sites, and the ICH 2003 convention is really about everything else. So it's about beliefs, values, cultural expressions, artifacts, ways of being, ways of life, and so forth. And so on the culture side, you have this really strong momentum in countries with the ratification of the 2003 convention. And then, of course, something that's fundamental for when we're talking about both environmental impact assessments and cultural impact assessments is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. That's really the text that frames the approach towards resources and rights of indigenous peoples. So what is a cultural impact assessment? That's a big question because people find it difficult to actually define culture itself. So there is a 1982 UNESCO definition. I'm not going to read it out to you, but you can look it up. And it's really, that's sort of the fundamental, the fundamental definition that everyone relies on or talks about when you need to define what culture is, right? So it's really about ways of life, right? So it's belief systems, expressions of culture, artifacts, etc. So when we're talking about cultural impact assessments also, it's sometimes a bit tricky because we use different terminology, or different terminology is used sometimes to talk about the same thing. So in Hawaii, for instance, CIAs are often just called cultural surveys. So there's a lot of them happening. They're really, if you want to look at good cultural surveys, good cultural impact assessments. There's a lot of examples in Hawaii. Then you have cultural heritage assessments. Then you have archaeological impact assessments. Sometimes they're called, CIAs are called community-based impact assessments. So you have all kinds of terminology around CIAs, which makes it a bit more confusing. So in our region and maybe generally, legislative and administrative guidelines at national levels are not always very clear. Then one of the issues is who's going to do CIAs, who's responsible for CIAs. So often we're on different legislative tracks. So if I come back to UNESCO, UNESCO conventions and the work relating to implementation of these conventions goes through departments of culture, ministries of culture where there are ministries, but mostly departments of culture in our region. And then you have sometimes World Heritage even comes under departments of environment, right, because of natural World Heritage. And often there's not a lot of communication between the departments of environment and the departments of culture. And in Fiji, it's the Fiji Museum that's actually responsible for the archaeological impact assessments. And those are the only types of CIAs that we have in Fiji. Trying to find out more about CIAs is not that easy. If you do a Google search, you may not find a lot, right? So you have to go to some really good websites that have reports up that are useful. For instance, is the New Zealand Association of Impact Assessments. They have some really good examples there, particularly because of the strength of Maori research and work around cultural impact assessments. And then, in many places, there's no sort of mainstreaming of CIAs within EIAs. And like I've said, there's no standard practice. But if you look at Canada, Hawaii, and Aotearoa, you'll find some good examples. And sorry to rush through all this, but I know our time is limited. So this is the definition that the Akwekon guidelines provide. And by the way, Akwekon, if you don't know it, means is a Mohawk word. So First Nation, Native American word for everything in creation. Which is appropriate when you're talking about a CIA. And I think this is really a good definition. So evaluating the likely impacts of a proposed development on the way of life of a particular group of community of people with full involvement of this group and possibly even undertaken by this group or community of people. So obviously it looks at impacts, beneficial or otherwise, but this is what a CIA does. It looks at impacts on values, belief systems, customary laws, languages, custom, economy, relationship with the local environment or particular species, social organization and traditions of the affected community. So if you're looking for guidance about what a CIA should provide, I think this one is really good. And as part of CIAs, doing types of mapping while you're doing the impact assessment is also really beneficial. And even more so if the community is really doing the mapping with whoever is coming in to help do the cultural impact assessment. So there's other definitions. There's this international network for cultural diversity. So they have a working group on CIAs. And again, this is sort of the list of things that should be considered in a CIA. One, often in CIAs, we may not, in environmental impact assessments, things like natural resources, non-timber resources for crafts may not be measured, but they're very important for local communities. And obviously things like medicinal plants is something extremely important. And these things tend to kind of fall under the radar in policy and in assessments in our region. So I'm just going to give a few examples of cultural impact assessments in our countries. Again, there's no real standard approach. I wanted to give an example of some cultural impact that was listed in the 2015 EIA for a temporary wharf in Port Vila, because I think this is really gives an example of the types of things or the types of matters that CIAs look at. So in this case, I don't know if all of you are familiar, but in Ifira is island that's just off of Port Vila in Vanuatu. And is the home of the native giant octopus. So this, including this in the EIA acknowledges the kinship relationships and the ancestral linkages that the people have today with the octopus. It's very hard to actually find a lot of examples of CIAs in the region, so I've pulled out the ones that I could find. I'm very aware that there's a representative, Calvin from Palau here, who would know a lot about this, about how the Bureau of Cultural and Historic Preservation works in Palau. And they have a national code. Sorry, my granddaughter just walked in. So they define their cultural resources, landscapes, spiritual places, beliefs, cultural expressions, and so forth. And then they have a rigorous process to ensure that there's an assessment every time there's a development. So their resource assessment, they're actually separate from the EIA and are also known as archaeological investigation. And they are conducted systematically, depending on the decision that the Bureau makes. And then no permit can be issued by the Environmental Quality Protection Board responsible for EIAs without approval of the Bureau. So Palau, within the Pacific Island countries, Palau, I may stand corrected on this, I think it has the most rigorous and effective system in place for conducting CIAs. That's just as an illustration that was lent to me by a friend who works there. So coming back to Fiji, only archaeological impact assessments are carried out and not systematically. It's the authority, as I stated earlier, was with the Fiji Museum. And the legislation is from 1940, so we have some work to do to update this. And if you look at most EIAs in Fiji, they do not include cultural impacts. And often the Fiji Museum intervenes and comes to do an assessment when the community raises an issue. And usually this is kind of in the later stages of the environmental impact assessments that are happening. And there's little or no focus on other aspects of culture, particularly the intangible cultural heritage, although the Fiji Museum is very much aware of the linkages between sites and intangible cultural heritage, but its mandate is quite limited by the 1940 Act. So moving forward, what do we really need to do? We need to look at best practices globally and regionally. And I think we really have some great examples in our neighboring countries, the Hawaiian Cultural Surveys, the Tangata Whenua Impact Assessments in New Zealand, and I think the Aquacon guidelines are really useful for us to redefine EIAs in the region. And then we need more dialogue and collaboration between different government departments. And we need to review policies and legislation, but as we know, that's very time-consuming and often quite difficult for countries and takes a long time, a lot of resources and money. So I just wanted to finish by giving, sorry, I'll just unshare. So if I can figure this out. Yep. I just wanted to give some examples of not directly cultural impact assessments, but on work that we've done that has a similar approach. Post-disaster needs assessments require sort of mapping of cultural resources. So when doing CIAs, there are similarities with exercises such as post-disaster needs assessment. I've done some work with Vanuatu, with the International Organization for Migration, with some colleagues, Anna Naupa, some of you may know her, and others in Vanuatu on looking at cultural approaches to displacement. And in some ways, the tools that we produce for that are quite good guidelines for how to include culture. What are we talking about when we're talking about culture, and how do we include culture? So there are some tools, and I think really right now the part of the problem is sort of a lack of a policy and legislative environment for these things to happen. Because a lot of our legislation in the Pacific, this is not the case of Palau and some of the North Pacific countries that have historic preservation offices, but in the rest of the region, we really do not have legislation or even policies to guide cultural impact assessments. Right, so I think I'll finish there. Thank you for your patience, and I hope that was useful. And of course, I'm available if anyone wants to discuss this further. And Palau, I hope I didn't misrepresent your work. Thank you.
Wow. Pinaka Vakalevu, Professor Elise. That was a really insightful presentation. I think that's the first time I've actually gone that in-depth on cultural impact assessment. So you can tell my colleagues and I here have been, note-taking quite a bit. So thank you so much for that sharing. Mm-hmm. Colleagues, in the interest of time, we certainly have a lot of questions and comments here as well. But perhaps we'll jump straight to the chat and sort of share some of the comments and questions that we have for Rebecca and Professor Elise. And then we'll share our final thoughts here and sort of wrap up our discussion this afternoon. So just going through the chat, Rebecca, I think this one is for you. We have a sort of a question here from Mel Brown. And she says, "Hi, Rebecca. This is fantastic. Have you got any tips or thoughts on communicating to a project proponent that their desired timeline may not be realistic? That is, to enable meaningful engagement with community on their terms and timeframes."
Yeah, thanks, Mel. It's such a common situation to be in, I think, too. I've been in projects where they said, "Oh, we're going to do the consultation over this 2-week period." You might even be a couple of days, and you're like, "How is that going to happen in that time frame?" So look, I mean, my advice on this is actually just to be, really quite direct and frank in terms of engaging with, I guess, project leadership or project funders, and actually explain, to do this properly and to meaningfully engage with people. This is what's going to be involved in to do that, and then the time needed to actually do that properly. So I would be quite direct about that. Often the constraint is not just time, but also resources. And I think, too, that's, the budgets are often put together by, quite frankly, project engineers, for projects. They don't even often know what might be required in terms of the social impact side of things, or the cultural impact side of things, at least, as well. And actually, ensuring that you do that. So I think it is just a communication and dialogue aspect. I have found in my experience that going back to donors or funders and actually explaining that you need extra resources or extra money to support something is generally well supported. They just need someone to explain why that is. So that would be my tips. Lots of communication, and ask for extra money or extra time if you need it.
Thank you, Rebecca. I think this is a comment from Fiona Rody from Solomon. Hi, Fiona. And she says, "Thanks, Rebecca, for sharing a lot of good information about SIA in the Pacific context. I agree with you that it's important to understand power dynamics and to place SIA in the local context. I also think that involving locals who are aware of community dynamics in the early stages of the project is important." Thank you, Fiona. Very good comment. Rebecca is nodding, so definitely agrees with you. From Philip Yongano, he says, "Hi, Rebecca. It's always very important to keep social impact documents and processes simple and practical. But it can also depend on the country's procedures and guidelines. In Solomon Islands, there are still gaps in the EIA procedure and guidelines that sometimes make social impact documents simple a challenge. So national guidelines plays vital role in the effectiveness of social impact documents." Any thoughts, Rebecca?
Yes, I think that's a really, really good point. Because often I think we are working in terms of whatever frame it is, whether it's national legislation. A lot of the work I do is for projects that are funded by the multilateral organisations like World Bank or ADB, and they do expect a lot of paperwork, quite frankly. So my advice is to have even have 2 separate documents. Have your big document where all the detail is in there and you're meeting all your compliance requirements, but perhaps have something that's a shorter document that you can use on a daily basis. So that would be my advice. I think it's a really tricky one because, we do have that expectation in terms of those really lengthy documents, unfortunately. But yeah, I reckon maybe 2 documents sometimes is the way to go.
Good point, Rebecca. Thank you very much. I think we have some more sort of comments in the chat as well. This one is from Elijah. And he says, "Culture has always been part of the environment. However, the recognition of culture as part of the environment is something that has been missing over the years." I think that's very true, Elijah, and hence why this discussion today is very important to get and listening about how CIA is better embedded into that EIA process. We also have a question here from our colleague from Tonga, Mr. Sione Tukia, and he asked, who is responsible for CIA? And maybe I'll put, I think Elise has sort of answered that through her discussion, but maybe to put it to you, Elise, if you have any experience in Tonga, who is responsible for cultural impact assessment? Who oversees that process?
Look, to my knowledge, there isn't really a process or a standard. This is what I was saying, like in legislation or policy, there's usually different tracks, right, between environment that looks at the implementation of the CBD, and then you have the departments of culture or the division of culture that look after the UNESCO conventions. And cultural impact, I mean, really good cultural impact assessments that I've seen, as I've said, are really mostly in the countries, slightly outside of our direct region. So, presumably it would be the division of culture, but I've never actually seen one. And this is why I was talking about this problem of having these different tracks that actually start from the global level, right? Because you have these conventions, these global conventions that are administered through different tracks in countries. And often departments of environment are filled with people whose qualifications are more in sort of environmental studies, biology, and so forth, right? And then in the divisions of culture, you have more people who are, work on cultural aspects of science. So there may be in countries, processes within environmental legislation, but what we see is often quite weak in terms of inclusion, real inclusion of culture in a holistic way. And there was a question also on, should CIAs be part of social impacts? No, because then they get subsumed. Culture just gets subsumed under social. And what often happens is that people confuse culture and social, right? So they then think, oh, if we've done a social impact assessment, we've actually been inclusive of culture. No, culture is a world of its own, and it's huge. If you look at the ACWECON guidelines and other statements around the importance of culture, it covers a whole range of things within communities, right? So it's a big package. So my view is that no, they should be separate, but they should be systematic. So when you do an EIA, you also do a cultural impact assessment.
Thank you, Elise. That's a very good point you raised there, because quite a few of the comments or questions in the chat are sort of trying to bring CIA and SIA together. And like you mentioned in your presentation earlier, CIA is not SIA. So I guess that's a very important distinction that we need to understand to ensure both areas are well captured. I think you've responded to, I guess, some of the questions here. But we also have this comment from Lemban Kaki from PNG. And they say in PNG, CIA is a part of SIA, and together with EIA, all form part of ESIA, as Environmental and Social Impact Assessment, and conducted as part of overall regulatory processes under the Environment Act. Anything cultural, whether it's permit or artifacts, is managed by the National Museum and the Art Gallery, the NMAG, and the overall study is guided by the Environment Act, managed by the Conservation Environment and Protection Authority, who issue the environmental permits and approvals associated with a project. So I guess this is another thought of, again, merging all these issues into one sort of holistic form of assessment. Not sure what you think about that, Professor.
Yeah, I mean, what tends to happen is that so if you look at the example I gave from Vanuatu, right, that's a tiny section in an environmental impact assessment on that wharf, right? So it's so the fact that if I go back a bit, what's happened in our region is that often the culture sector is under-resourced, both in terms of human resources and in terms of funds. So what happens is that they often, a lot of countries, and not all countries, but a lot of countries struggle with trying to actually develop really strong systems to have proper cultural impact assessments, or to have actually cultural mapping, which can serve as the basis of an assessment. So a lot of our so Fiji, for instance, has done traditional, what you call traditional mapping, right, through initially the Department of Culture and Heritage, and then as under the Ministry of Itoke Affairs. So they have a lot of data. So if you were to have legislation for specifically cultural impact assessments, or if the Department of Environment were to modify its environmental legislation to include cultural impact assessments as part of EIAs, there would be already a lot of data that would help in conducting CIAs. But currently, like I showed that the legislation, the only impact assessments are archaeological, and with a legislation that dates from 1940. So we're really behind on what should be happening.
Thank you, Professor. And I think our next question is also very important. This is from Margaret. And Margaret says, great presentations. Thank you so much. I think it will be great to share specific case studies on SIA and CIA to help with learning. Also, I think it will be great to look at how SIA and CIA are integrated at a project planning stage, and ensuring that these requirements are visible and inclusive during project evaluation, management, and implementation. And I certainly agree, Margaret, thank you so much for sharing. I think today was sort of touching more on these concepts, sort of exploring them from a theoretical perspective. But, Professor Elise, like you mentioned, it'd be good to look at, in practice, how for a specific project, how CIA would apply, and how would you go about applying those principles that we've discussed. So perhaps that will be another discussion that we can have for a future webinar.
Yeah.
Okay.
As I said, I mean, the really good examples are in our neighbors' countries. Although Palau would have good examples of cultural surveys, because they've done a lot. I mean, even in the World Heritage, because of the Rock Islands World Heritage site, they would have done a lot of work around there. So, yeah. Examples are always good. I agree.
Thank you, Professor. And perhaps I'll just read through some of the rest here. I think most of these are just participants sharing their comments and their thoughts as well. I think we have another one here from Brown, Melanie Brown or Mel Brown. And he says, PNG often requires ecosystem services assessments, which capture some of the CIA components. Impact assessments on intangible heritage is also required. We also have a comment here from Fidelis Yamangi. They say, that is a big discussion on whether to include culture as part of sustainable development principle or not. I think keeping it separate assessment at this point of time is good until further studies and links are established between culture and the social aspect. I think that would be a dissertation on its own, Fidelis. That would be a good topic to explore with Professor. We have a comment here as well from Malachi. I think he's also sharing the thought here that CIA are and can be included in the various assessments, whether it's for the construction, environmental, social management plans, or the environmental and social management plans relating to project administration manuals and project operation manuals. Good point there, Malachi. And another comment here from Mireya Kaufman. She says, thank you, Rebecca and Elise, for the presentation. My question is, as an American, how should I navigate doing research to benefit Pacific Island nations without getting negatively perceived by indigenous cultures? I'm very passionate about cultural and environmental conservation in the Pacific, specifically, and want to be as respectful as possible. I just hope I get well received because I truly care and want to help with environmental research that honors and preserves indigenous cultures. Well, I think I'll hand that maybe to Rebecca and then to Professor Elise.
Oh, I think that, I think it's something that I think as an international consultant that comes into the Pacific, something that I always worry about as well. I think, I think to understand and really to try and involve working with local people as much as possible is really key in relation to that. The worst projects I guess I've seen happen is where you just have an international person that comes in and does research or does something and leaves again, and no one knows what happened, what they did, or what they were talking about. So I think that invitation and walking together as you're doing activities is really key.
Yeah, I support that answer by Rebecca. I'm obviously not from the region originally. Now been in the Pacific for about 30 years. And I'll just give you a quick example. When I first started doing some work on governance in Samoa, well, first I partnered with a researcher from Samoa, but I started interviewing people because we were looking at doing possibly a book or on governance in Samoa, and by the second person I interviewed, I said, "Oh, why don't you write the chapter because you know all about this?" And so we ended up doing a book on governance in Samoa written by all Samoans. And I think that illustrates kind of the way to do things is don't put yourself in somebody else's shoes, but if you have the means to provide an opportunity for researchers and local communities and so forth, you do that because ultimately it benefits the people that you're working with, and that's really important. Yeah.
Thank you, Rebecca and Professor Elise. Those are some good points there for you, Mireya Kaufman, and all the best in your pursuits. Maybe one more comment here from the chat. I know there's a lot of discussion, colleagues, but we don't want to keep you on this chat for too long. So I'll just read out the comment here from Daniel Gulliver. And he says, thank you for the detailed and well thought through presentations. As a social practitioner, I agree with each of your points, especially in terms of social safeguard documentation. International finance institutions require more and more robust documentation, which is important, but can also at times be counterproductive to succinct documents that are easily understood or implemented for non-practitioners, particularly for minor development activities. I often approach this by having appendices that are summaries of key actions or activities, which can be regularly updated or circulated. Elise, it was useful to hear your thoughts on where CIA sits within the process. I have seen CIA outlined under environmental and social sections, or even split across two, PCR under environment and CH under social. Very good points, Daniel, and thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. Colleagues, before I let you go, I just also have to mention that we do have one of our World Bank colleagues online, Miss Rachel Marburg. Rachel has previously, joined us and has presented extensively on many social impact assessment topics. Of course, she's a social specialist with the World Bank office in Sydney, and she's also joining us today. So thank you for joining us, Rachel. I just wanted maybe to pass it on to you. Share your thoughts. There's been a lot of extensive discussions happening here. Just wanted to also hear your thoughts, Rachel. Oh, sorry, colleagues. I think Rachel may have dropped out there. I know we've kind of gone way beyond initial time, but forgive us. The discussion was really, that interesting. But maybe I'll pass it on to my colleagues here who are in the room with me, just to share perhaps their thoughts on the program today and the extensive discussion before we call it a day. Uta, any thoughts?
Thank you, everyone. Maybe just a quick takeaways combining the two presenters views and sharing. And I think it's you agree that social impact assessment is gaining recognition.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah? And I think it is also about time that we do things differently and think about on how to pursue social the protection of the social protection and elements in project planning and implementation. Perhaps social impact assessment should be a standalone process by itself, rather than embedding it in the in the environmental impact assessment process as it mostly stands now. So just just a thought on that, and it can lead to to the refining or the formulation of national regulatory frameworks governing this social aspect and structures protection. So yes, it's EIA is evolving, and therefore we should also evolve how things are done to keep up with with the evolving and new emerging issues around our projects. Thank you.
Thank you, Buta. Very good point. I think both presenters today have spoken extensively about evolution, how CIA has evolved over the years, and also social impact assessment. It's now a standalone sort of field on its own. Maybe Ratuvai, any thoughts from your end?
Thank you, Ivan. Yeah, just very quickly, because I know we have overstepped our time a bit. I just want to thank you both again, Rebecca and Professor Elise, for the excellent presentations and the insights that you've brought to our audience this afternoon. I do just want to highlight a few points. I think what you mentioned, Rebecca, about SIA being context specific, is quite important and correctly, I mean, it is quite a good point because it recognizes the, as you said, the diversity across the region within our countries, and just a recognition that that the one size fits all approaches would not work in this respect. And just the point that you gave about having social impacts and biophysical impacts assessed on an equal footing, I think was quite important and a good point to make across the 7 aspects that you highlighted. I think something that resonates with our region is the reference to FPIC, free and prior informed consent. Because as we know, that sits well with our region, given the fact that 80 to 90% of our land and marine resources fall under customary ownership. And also those culturally important engagements is another one I think that's quite important for our region. And references that you made to some methodologies and approaches that we are using now to get some meaningful dialogue with local communities such as Talanoa that we widely practice, and some examples from Tonga like Tikakala. Yeah, thank you again also, Professor Elise. I think one of the things that sort of the recurring themes that come out of both of your presentations is that the quality of the engagement with local communities, as well as that free and prior informed consent. I think what you also mentioned about the difficulties of defining CIA is well noted, given that there are different forms of CIA practiced around the region, and you had highlighted some examples from Hawaii, as well as in Vanuatu, I think. As well, thank you also for that lengthy but comprehensive definition of CIA. I think it is quite. It is a bit of a mouthful, but it does cover all the bases, I think, at this point. And yeah, I just also want to acknowledge the excellent feedback and perspectives also provided by our colleagues and practitioners online. I think has made for a really good mix of discussion and food for thought as we move forward in bringing these elements into more prominent space within the EIA discipline. So that's all from me, but I'll hand it back to Ivan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ratubai. I think you've summed up our discussion today very well. So in the interest of time, I would just like to say thank you so much, Rebecca and Elise, for joining us today. Really appreciate the time and really appreciate the insightful discussion and thought-provoking sort of knowledge that you have shared with us today. I have the feeling that this would not be the last, so please do not get upset if I reach out to you again so we can continue this discussion. Now to our colleagues joining us online from all across the region and beyond, thank you so much as well for making the time this afternoon. I know you still have a lot of comments, thoughts, questions for Professor Elise and Rebecca. So after this meeting, hopefully with Professor and Rebecca's support, I'll also be sharing their contact information in addition to the recording and also the slides from today's presentation. And of course, the PNEA is there if you would like to continue this discussion. We do have the Pacific Network for Environmental Assessment, so let's carry this discussion there. Rebecca is an avid member of the PNEA, so you can find her there as well. But for now, colleagues, thank you so much. You have a blessed rest of the day, and we'll stay in touch. Papetai lava and mode.
Thank you.
Mode, inaka, mode.
Mode.